going to make the first question, if to improve the NHS, does it need more or less private sector involvement?
My personal view is that it's not as clear-cut as sometimes the media make it out to be in terms of private versus public. And the reason I say that is, as an optician, I owned my own business. I supplied services to the NHS. I invested in my equipment. I was the first digital optometrist in the community using the latest software. I was able to do that because I was able to make that investment and choose to do that. That is very different from a venture capital company investing in an organisation like Hinchinbrook, who are there for their profit, to make profit for their shareholders, to make a relatively quick win in terms of making money and then exiting, which they have done sooner than I think anyone expected. So that's why I say it's not quite as clear-cut, because I think to lose some of the entrepreneurs who are involved in the smaller businesses that support the NHS, I think we would really lose out. And the other factor to bear in mind is that we did an audit of how much of the NHS budget was actually spent in the private sector, and we included in that the amount that is spent on drugs, on GPs, which are also individual businesses, on IT support. So a lot of services which you might not think are private or think of as being fundamental to the NHS. We found that 28% of the NHS budget was spent on business in one form or another. Without that, the NHS would collapse. So my point is simply it's not quite as clear-cut as some people think, but as for making excessive profits out of the NHS, I think that's iniquitous.
Great, thank you. Norman, evidence from independent, well-respected bodies such as the Nuffield Trust Health Think Tank, as well as campaign groups like Keep Our NHS Public and the NHS Support Federation show that under the 4.5 years of the government that you've been a member of for that time, commercial involvement in the NHS has widened and deepened, with some companies earning contracts worth sometimes £500 million. How do you feel about that, particularly in light of the Circle disaster up the road in Cambridgeshire?
Well, I think, first of all, my understanding, and I might have got this wrong, but my understanding is that private providers make up about 6% of the NHS, as it was, and it was 5% about 4.5 years ago.
This is an important point, because this statistic that Norman just given us comes up repeatedly in this discussion. Your own Department of Health's annual accounts that came out last year show that the amount of money in the previous year of the roughly £110 million budget that went to non-NHS providers was just over 10 billion for the first time. Some of those have all been charities and third sector organisations, and just under a further £1 billion of Department of Health money went to non-NHS providers non-state providers of social care. So we're talking 10 or 11 billion pounds going outside the NHS. Whether or not it's all to Virgin Care, Circle, etc., nobody, I think, at the moment knows.
Okay. Well, let me try and give you what my perspective on this is. I have no interest at all in a sort of rush to privatise the NHS, or to suddenly think that private providers provide the answer. I don't think that. I want us to have a rational debate about this subject. I want us to be also honest at what has happened. I think, for example, of the PFI programme under the last government, which mortgaged the future of the NHS in a wholly incompetent way, in my view, to the tune of over £80 billion. Now, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a very good use of money. Over the course of the next Parliament, we'll be spending over £11 billion on PFI contracts, on the payments, the annual payments. That doesn't sound to me like very much sense. My preference, and I think we all have this is why we have to have this open debate about the NHS. We all have to think about how we achieve better value from the system, given that £30 billion challenge. And I think actually the answer lies in the workforce of the NHS. And I commissioned Chris Ham to do a report on the role of mutualism and social enterprise. Now, within community health services, quite a lot of social enterprises have set up non-profit making social enterprise, and their record looks very encouraging. Is there a role for giving staff of an organisation within the NHS? I'm not talking about organisations leaving the NHS, but I think of foundation trusts. Is there anything brilliant and wonderful about the governance and structure of a foundation trust? I don't think so. I don't think they tend to treat their staff particularly well very often. It's very much often, not always, top-down management. My preference is for these organisations to have an option of engaging their staff, of enabling their staff to have a stake in the organisation. It doesn't have to be any profit element to it, but the mere fact of having a stake and having a say in the way the organisation is run tends to demonstrate, according to the evidence, improved productivity. So I put my faith, in a way, in the staff of this amazing organisation and think that they provide part of the answer, not part of the problem. So that's my preference, rather than fragmenting the system in the way that some people fear would happen if the private sector played a bigger role.
Okay. Thank you, Norman. Bruce, everyone in the NHS and in the political world are set on integration. Many people who argue about privatisation say that's the direct enemy of integration, that it's incompatible with it because it will further deepen the fragmentation of the NHS that you talked about in your interview in The Guardian today. Would privatisation, I'm slightly paraphrasing or taking a different slant on the question, do you agree that it would be unhelpful to, indeed, the enemy of integration if you have more and more companies, profit-driven, providing more and more services at a time whenever the NHS needs to be a whole more than ever before?
I need to preface that by saying that discussions on privatisation get bogged down by the fact that privatisation means something different to everybody. So frankly, opticians, pharmacists, general practitioners are all private practitioners who are contracted into the NHS at one level. So at another level, they share the values of the NHS and they don't use that money for personal gain. They use it for the gain of their organizations and their patients. The issue about privatization, I think, that tends to inflame discussion is about the use of that money for shareholder benefit, if you like. And I think there are a few people who necessarily support that. I think in NHS England, I'd like to make it clear that about 6.2% of our budget is spent on the private sector. Additional 3% is spent on organizations such as social enterprises and charities and what have you. And if you talk about that, then I think they can make a pretty major contribution towards integration. One thing I would also say is that we also have a moral duty to seek the best possible advice on how we run our services and the best intellectual input from anywhere. What we're not in the business is selling off assets, if you like, for the purposes of commercial profit.
One last thing, setting the question of mutuals aside that Norman Lamb talked about, do you have any sort of instinctive anxiety about Serco providing GP services in Cornwall or Virgin Care providing children's services in Devon, for example? Should those companies be allowed to make profits out of people's health needs?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. On the basis that those people who commission the services will need to make a decision about what alternatives are on offer. And in some cases, that's quite a difficult decision because there isn't a local NHS alternative.
But the central
the preference needs to be for an NHS provider. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mark Porter.
Thank you. Two things I want to say. One is about general practice, the other is about orthopaedic surgery.
Sorry. Yes, we're on the last response to the question that most people wanted posed. Bear with me one second. Mark is signaling.
Quite right, and my apologies. I'll try to be very quick. General practice. It must be said that most GPs wouldn't say that they're private practitioners. I would note that because many general practices are contracted to the NHS, the majority are, but how many of you know that it's actually against the law to sell a general practice? It's also against the regulations of the NHS for a GP to control their workload in the way that a private business would. And the fact that you can't sell the business or control its customers means that it's a contracted NHS business, not a private business, and we should remember that about general practice. The second thing that needs to be said, and I'll just give an example about privatisation and its potential dangers, because I'm instinctively opposed to the process of privatisation. But actually, I went down this morning to talk to the British Orthopaedic Association, by coincidence, not in preparation for this. And they were telling me about processes that are happening in some of the hospitals that they work in as orthopaedic surgeons, whereby a number of hip and joint replacements, the operations that can be done on a reasonable cost and volume basis, are being taken off by private providers or contracted to private providers by the local NHS organisations. And yet, of course, the price for the easy and the difficult operations is the same because the tariff pays an average price. And yet the easy operations are being done in the profitable part of the private sector and the difficult operations are being left for the National Health Service, which then cannot recruit its workers.